Hi, this is Dave Michels, and today I've got a video cast about the Infonetics. Here we go. How to get that Infonetics report that came out in May on Cloud UC. And with me, I have two Cloud UC or UCaaS experts, or perhaps better described as former experts, to chime in on this conversation. We'll start off here with Brad. Brad, you're no longer in UC as a service. You're in a knowledge something. What are you working with?
Yeah, I'm working with a new company called Dialexa, where I'm Chief Operating Officer. Dialexa is a Internet of Things and software development company. We really try and solve customers' hardest problems. We actually do some.
Enough on that, Brad. Okay, but more importantly, your previous job was at Genband. You've held various roles at Genband. Most recently, the CMO position. So you've got a pretty good knowledge of what's going on in the UCaaS space.
I do.
How long did you leave Genband?
Yeah, I was at Genband for 8 years and at Nortel for 8 years before that. So I held almost every role that you can imagine.
All right, and you know Diane from your role, your time.
I do know Diane very well.
I'm referring to what's Diane's last name?
Diane Myers.
Diane Myers, thank you. Who is the lead author of this report? And Scott Wharton. You worked at BroadSoft like 10 years ago, or like a lifetime ago. More recently at Vidtel, and when you were at BroadSoft, you actually worked with Diane, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah. And what are you up to these days?
Working on the next thing.
Working on the next thing. All right. Well, so let's start off talking about this UCaaS report. There's not very many UCaaS reports like this that I've seen where they compare multiple vendors. Most analyst reports profile one vendor at a time. And so the ones that come out to mind, the primary one that comes out to mind is the Magic Quadrant UCaaS report put out by Gartner. I think Frost does a report. I've never actually seen one of Frost's reports. Does Frost do a multi-vendor comparison, or do we know?
I don't know. I never saw a Frost report myself either.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe these might be the only two that are out there that really compare multiple vendors. A little bit different, as Brad just pointed out before we started here, is that the Infonetics report is focused on North America, where the Gartner 2014 report, the 2015 report has not come out yet. The Gartner's 2014 report was multi-region, and so the inclusion criteria is a little bit different. So you see some different vendors in each report. And of course, the methodologies are very, very different, why they have very different outcomes. So let me just start off a little bit with just a brief description of this report. What Infonetics does is they present a scorecard for the vendors, and it's a stack ranking of several different categories. Let me just see if I can pull the categories up here. What page is that on? Here we go. No, that's not it. Here we go. So there's the size, the seats installed, or the size of the base. So that's one part of the ranking. And then there's the financial stability of the provider, the market strategy of the provider, the service development, and support options. And each of those get a different score, and then they add them all up, and then they get the top ranking. In Diane's report, the number one ranking this year went to 8x8, followed by West, followed by Vonage. Those are the top three. So with that, let me start off the first question here. What do you guys think of this approach, of this scorecard approach? Scott, why don't you start off?
Well, I think it's good that Diane looked at different attributes. I mean, one thing that jumped out at me is that 3 of the 5 attributes, there's almost no difference for all the players. They're either 4 or 5. And the only things that really matter are the installed base and the financial stability. So a lot of whether someone's ahead or not is really based on the number of seats they had. On the financial stability, I thought it was interesting that some of the smaller players like 8x8 and Vonage had the same ranking of 10 as a Verizon or Comcast. I think maybe a little generous toward the, even though they're public companies, 8x8 and Vonage, Comcast and Verizon have unlimited money and not going out of business soon. And then finally, I thought one thing that was interesting is there was very little focus on the criteria about technology edge. seemingly almost assuming that they have very much similar technology. And the one thing maybe that was not in there that I would have expected more is someone's marketing savvy. Because I think if you look at a lot of the reason behind why some of the players are on top, like 8x8 or RingCentral, a lot of it I think has to do with the fact that they're very good at customer acquisition and getting customers.
You think that's different than what she meant by market strategy?
I don't really know, because the market strategies are really similar. Maybe in market strategy it means which ones are going after which segments, or how smart they are kind of mirroring the Gartner vision statements about being in the quadrant. But I think marketing savvy and ability to execute on finding and acquiring customers at a reasonable cost point is probably one of the reasons why you look at certain players like I'll take 8x8 and RingCentral, maybe Vonage, why they stand out versus the dozens and dozens of other players who have very similar technology but don't seem to be able to break out.
That's a good point. I want to push back on one thing you said before we get to Brad, but you talked about the first thing you talked about was the installed base, the number of seats they have. Gartner does the same thing. Gartner puts a lot of emphasis in their Magic Quadrants on all their Magic Quadrants on growth and penetration of the market and stuff like that. I think of these analyst reports. Let me rephrase that. In the financial industry, when you look at analyst reports that are trying to find stocks to invest in, you're often looking for the one that you're looking to the analyst to identify this, the ones that haven't been discovered. What's the one I don't know about? Tell me as an analyst, you've been researching this, what stock should I invest in that is yet to be discovered that's a great time to buy into? And it seems like the technical analysts, Gartner and Infonetics, they purposely avoid that, right? They really look for proven success as they make their recommendations and identify their leaders and stuff. And what do you think of that approach? Do you think that's fair to if you're well-funded and you've got capability, you got great product, you're not going to be a leader or, a recognized front runner in any of these reports. Do you think that's reasonable or what's your take on that?
Well, I think it partly depends on the market segment that you're going after, and it depends on the analyst report. Like, I think the reason why Gartner may have the bigger guys out there is there's almost there may be a conflict of interest that the bigger guys are funding them. So they have to tread a little bit more lightly on them, whereas the financial analysts are paid for finding out people that would be more of the up-and-coming ones. I think if I look at this report and you try to glean out who some of the up-and-coming players, Thinking Phones may be one for me that jumps out, that they don't have the same brand as an 8x8 or RingCentral because they're not public, but they've probably acquired more customers faster and they've grown faster. And also on the marketing strategy, I think they really stand out as being one of the few players that's really focused on the mid-market, whereas I think all the other players may have started out with consumer or SME and are now looking to bolt on or add this enterprise market. Thinking Phones started there from the beginning, so I think that really differentiates them and maybe gives them an edge. Well,
that's a good segue. Let me ask Brad. And Brad, I want to. The original question still stands. What do you think of this approach? But the new question on top of that is. The Magic Quadrant, Gartner, that as Scott was just mentioning, is really very much generally targeted toward a large enterprise audience. And UCaaS as a category has generally been more attractive to the SMB or the smaller business sectors. Do you think that there's a gap there that Gartner is not capturing in their methodology and their design of the Magic Quadrant, capturing the needs and wants of a smaller business? And so 2 questions for you to start off with.
Yeah, let's start with the second because I think I'll forget it by the time we get back to the first, but I can remember the first. So I'll start with the second. I do definitely feel like Gartner's missing something, and I do agree with what Scott said about this conflict of interest with Gartner. I think that it's very hard for Gartner to separate their business model from their marketing model or from their reporting model. It's I think that the main thing that I see in this small medium business gap is that really you're not seeing the growth patterns in the numbers. So really, and I think that Scott alluded to that, but he didn't say it explicitly. So I want to say it explicitly. What you're not really seeing is what a financial person or even a good business person would be looking for. What is the market capture rate as a percent year over year or quarter over quarter of these players? And neither one of the reports really show that. And that's, if I were going to invest in the company, which when you're making a business decision, you're really investing in the company. it would be one of the things that I would want to see.
But she is showing, in her defense, she is showing financial stability, and
that may,
if you had high churn, you had high churn, you wouldn't have financial stability.
Yeah, and that does, but it's hard to say what those criteria are. So going back to the first question, I like Diane's methodology much better than Gartner's. I think it's more transparent, it's more logical. Sometimes I felt that Gartner's was, they may call it a magic quadrant for a reason, because sometimes it feels like magic on how the things end up where they end up. With Diane's, you can definitely tell what she's doing and how she's doing. So the few things, though, with that transparency that I somewhat take a stance against is I don't think the weightings are right. I think the weightings, and again, Scott alluded to this, I think that total user base may not be not need to be weighted. I think that there's a weighting of 10 versus 10 for financials, 5 for the other three things: market strategies, service development, and support options. So if you look at that, your market strategy is being weighted half of what your installed base is. So it just feels like the weightings are an interesting weighting. And then again, the spreads between numbers are very small. So the actual true weight that each one gets, especially on the last three, market strategy, service capability, and support options, is very small. So I think that it does come down to reading the paragraphs more than it does looking at these numbers. And so when you look at the paragraphs, I think you get a lot more out of this report. And I always really treated Diane's reports that way. The numbers are fun and good for the executives to look at, but if you want something deep out of this report, you need to read Diane's recommendations, because each one of these, I'd say the majority of these service providers would be a good fit for a company. Now, it depends on the company, their size, what they want, and how they're trying to take advantage of UC. So I think different ones have different advantages for different people.
All right, let me chime in on that first question. I agree. This is a much more transparent report. That's a good word. I think you used that, Brad. And she provides a lot more information. The Magic Quadrant, they don't really reveal their weightings. They don't reveal all the criteria that they're looking at, and that's always been a little frustrating for me. On the other hand, I will disagree with both of you. I don't think the Gartner really has much of a conflict of interest in their business model. I know it certainly seems like they should, but just because I know most of the analysts there, they don't get any revenue incentive in their compensation based on subscriptions. They don't. If people buy reprint rights, even if some of these providers and vendors hire these guys to do keynotes, it's expensive to do that, but they don't get that. So I don't really think they have any financial incentive that would affect their objectivity. But certainly, as a company, Gartner would seem that it would be in a conflict of interest, as they make most of their revenue from the same vendors that they're writing about.
And Dave, by the way, I know most of the people too, and I certainly am not making that an accusation or even a feeling that I have about the people. It is just the problem with their model is that it feels that way, and it's hard to get away from that feeling. So I completely agree with what you said. I think that it's without that exposure to the criteria, it always feels that from the vendor side that you have no way to influence that. It'd be better if you knew what you were trying to get to be able to do better. So you always feel like you're working in a black box.
Yeah, I understand that frustration. All right, let me change questions here. When I look at Diane's report, she's got 10 vendors in her scorecard. It's the top 10 vendors. Theoretically, I guess she has a scorecard that goes much longer. When I look at the scorecard and the vendors on here, I see a pretty good mixture of, Scott was talking about the technology. Some of them have their own technology. Some of them are buying technology from other vendors. And there's no clear answer there. Do you think having your own technology, in theory, would give a vendor a benefit because they have control of everything, but it also puts them in two separate business models: software development and UCaaS? What are your thoughts on UCaaS leadership and technology sourcing for these providers? Scott.
Well, I'm probably a little bit biased after spending 9 years at BroadSoft, but
a decade ago, so you can't be too biased.
Well, true, but I still believe that the BroadSoft platform and the people that work there, I think it's very solid, and still continue to keep up with people who are in the UCaaS space who are very, very positive about the technology. And the thing that's always surprised me is that the leaders who have more subs tend to be the ones that build their own technology. Now, one could draw the conclusion from that building your own technology has an advantage, or that the technology is better. I kind of draw the opposite conclusion. I think that the people who have built their own technology just tend to be a little bit more innovative and tend to be a little bit better at marketing. Again, like an 8x8 or Ring Central. And I think that it's just a challenge that BroadSoft has, is that they have to get behind certain channels and they don't really have control over, selling to the end user. And some of the players they have, like a Comcast or Verizon, they're strong, but they're slow and steady. And these other guys, I think, can jump out ahead and be a little bit more innovative, not because of the technology they have, but maybe in spite of it.
Okay. Brad?
I think it's a really interesting question, and it really goes down to the age-old IT question: build versus buy. Really, when you should buy is when it doesn't, it isn't core to your business. You can't get any competitive advantage from it, and you should build it when you can get competitive advantage. And I think you've seen on these charts and through the last few years that if you build it yourself, you can come up with features that you can sell for more and get some competitive advantage. Although we are driving to a much more commoditized UC market where there's not many more things that are great that we can think of to make this basic UC differentiated. So then it becomes much more of a buy decision in my mind. Although BroadSoft is keeping up very well with the market, as are many other vendors like my old friends at Genband. I do think that there is some major advantages to building yourself. The other thing is that I do think that an interesting addition recently to BroadSoft was the pickup of mPortal, which will really help them in this regard. My good friend DP Venkatesh is there, and he's the CEO of mPortal, and they're actually launching a BroadSoft design platform where they will help people to design their platforms and mobile applications and other things with mPortal embedded inside of BroadSoft. So I think that was a great move on their part and a good pickup.
That's good insights there. There's been actually quite a bit of acquisitions taking place in the space recently. Again, BroadSoft made a few, Vonage has made a few, and 8x8 just did 2 or 3. So we're seeing that pick up again. Let's get into some of these vendors in particular. When you looked at this scorecard where you saw 8x8 on top, what was your reaction, Brad? What was your?
I have a lot of respect for 8x8 and what they do, not only on the marketing side, but on the product side. They've kept the product simple. And like you say, the main market for UC currently is SMB and below. Big enterprises can't make that large of a change yet. It's a big change, ripping out all your PRIs and moving to full IP. I do see 8x8 looking at who their customer base is and who they're trying to serve and looking at it from a customer perspective better than some of the other vendors on here. And so I do agree that they would be in my top 2 or 3 on this list myself too.
8x8, they go back. They were one of the very first providers that I came across before I was really even looking for these providers. I remember hearing about them, and I was like, well, that'll never work. You have to get premises and all that stuff. So that was probably 2005 or something like that. And so they
actually they bought a hosted platform in 1999. Believe it or not. And then they were trying to sell it to compete with BroadSoft, and I think that wasn't working. So they shifted to more selling. And kind of my reaction based on that is I think 8x8 has succeeded partly because they've been doing it longer than anybody else. So part of it here is just last man. They've been out there the longest, so they have an advantage of just doing it for a long time.
Well, the
Whereas,
point that I was trying to get to was that they've really had a series of innovations, because along that, they were one of the first ones I saw that were doing video as a desktop feature. They were one of the first to embrace UC as opposed to just telephony. They were really early with the mobile clients, and so they've had a fairly innovative history. But as you pointed out, Scott, Diane doesn't seem to really rank their technology.
well, also, I'm not sure, I think when you're in the industry, we care about a lot of the new things that people add, but the reality is you still talk to end users. They really mostly don't care about all these features. I mean, most people pick up a phone and they dial and they could barely transfer a call, if they can do it at all. So I think as an industry, we tend to focus on all these new cool things that you can do. But the reality is it's providing a service, it's dial tone, it's making it work, it's having a reasonable price point. And I think that's part of the reason why you don't see any real differentiation in some of those other categories, service offerings, et cetera, because most customers, I think, want the stability of the service to work, which is actually kind of hard to make it work very reliably. And they care about a reasonable price. I mean, one observation about the report, too, is there was almost no mention about price. Whereas if you looked at 5-10 years ago, it was all about driving the price down and people having disruption. And you don't really see any of those disruptors in here anymore.
Good point. What about security as a feature? Some of these providers, 8x8's one of them, is really pushing encrypted provisioning, encrypted conversations. ShoreTel is going to be launching their new service, and they're making a big deal about encryption. So the reason I bring that one up is because it seems whenever you have a cloud conversation, you always have a security conversation soon after it. And so when you say that users don't really care a whole lot about features, do you think security is different than that?
I don't think people really, when they think about voice, they tend to separate it from things that you can get hacked into, like email and other things. I don't think they really think about security until something bad happens. And usually the things that may be bad that would happen would be like some kind of fraud where someone hacks into your system and steals long distance. But I think as long as companies can kind of prevent the fraud, or at least not pass on those fraud charges to their customers, it's almost something people don't even think about as something that might happen.
Yeah.
In the voice space. It's not really relevant. I remember this story at BroadSoft where we were launching in the early days. We were going to launch Kalia, and we decided not to announce it even though we were launching it. And the reason why we didn't is all of our customers assumed we already had it, even though we didn't.
I see.
It's like, why announce? Oh, no, we've now fixed the flaw that you didn't know that we had.
Yeah, when Skype added that feature, they didn't really announce it either, but that was for different reasons. Let's see. So continuing down the vendor list, Scott, I'm hoping you could clarify some confusion on West. West was ranked number 2 on this report, and when I get confused, and maybe I should be asking Brad, but are they based on BroadSoft or not? It's this M6, I think it is, or something.
The M6 is actually, it's a really funny story. It was originally a Genband platform that was sold to BroadSoft. So it is BroadSoft, but it is owned by, it was original IP of Genband. So, but the M6 is it's the original, I can't remember the name of the
Vocal Data.
Vocal Data, thank you. Thanks.
Yeah.
But also, it's not really clear, how many of their subs are actually on the BroadSoft platform versus the Cisco or Microsoft platforms, and it seems like West is in there. They almost don't really fit, in that they're mostly like a single tenant Cisco hosted service. So even though they have some subs, they're kind of a weird company to put into this mix because they don't really fit with the other ones.
I felt the same way. I felt like they're more of an aggregator than they are a true UC partner. And I don't know, they're very blurry lines there, and you could probably put a lot more people if you were putting West in, is really my point. And I think that's really the point that Scott made, is if you're going to let West in, there's a lot of other aggregator, reseller type services that you might want to let in. So it's a murky area.
Okay. The next one, number 3 on their list, is Vonage. And Vonage made the biggest leap from the previous year's scorecard to this year's scorecard, coming in 3rd. And they made that leap through acquisitions. There's been several. Any thoughts on Vonage becoming a business? I mean, they're so associated with residential, becoming a business UCaaS provider through acquisitions.
Well, Yeah, they made the scorecard mainly because of the acquisitions and the fact that the scorecard heavily weights user base. So they already had the financial stability and a pretty good market strategy and good support. So all they had to do is kick up their installed base, which they did with the acquisition. So it's a little, and that's what Diane says. So there's not much more to say about them if you're really just talking about how they made it. Vonage has been around as long as anybody. They were really one of the very original IP-based phone systems, and they've moved more and more into business as the time has gone on. I think these acquisitions have allowed them, to build out what they've been trying to do for a while organically, and I think it makes them a player in the enterprise space, especially in this SMB space, where an individual who owns a small business is much more likely to have already tried and used Vonage.
Yeah, and I think Vonage is an interesting case in that if you look at their press announcements and financial announcements, they really have made a very clear marker saying residential is essentially dead, and there's no real growth in that market. They've capitulated essentially to the cable companies and the free stuff like Skype or even mobile, where people are mostly not even having fixed lines at home anymore. They're just using their fixed line. Their mobile line. And they basically said, we're just going to look at residential as a cash cow and not invest in that anymore. And they're going to put all their investment into the business market. So I expect that Vonage will be much more of a player over the coming years. The other thing that's interesting is it probably didn't meet the deadline of this report, but Vonage acquired a company called GUnify, which I was involved in, that really gave them an edge over all the other players. And it allowed the better integration with Google and Salesforce.com and legal CRM systems, and it was a platform that was being used with essentially all the BroadSoft providers and then looking to be extended to other UC platforms, but now Vonage has it completely internally. So I think if you're looking at some technology competitive advantage, I think Vonage was very clever at swiftly moving and getting that all for themselves.
Do you anticipate Vonage will be making more acquisitions?
Well, I think they will, just mainly because their CEO came out of an investment banking point of view. I think it's one thing when you look at a lot of the players that are really active on the M&A side. You look at Mitel, you look at Vonage, you look at CEOs that come out of Wall Street at some form or another, and it's kind of in their DNA. Whereas I think you guys know doing the acquisitions is generally hard, and most of them fail anyway. So if people actually know how to do them and they put a process in place and a team, it's just natural that they're going to do more acquisitions. BroadSoft is the same way. BroadSoft's been very acquisitive over the last 10 years or so, and I expect they'll continue to do that as well.
Yeah, I think you're going to continue to see acquisitions on the provider side and the equipment and software vendor side. And it's just, though, all of those companies are still stuck between a customer that has a ton of power and downstream vendors that have a ton of power, so they have no choice but to consolidate.
One thing that's interesting on the acquisition side is that there have been a bunch of companies that I've worked with or talked to over the last 10 years that wanted to do a roll-up, mainly at BroadSoft providers or other host UCaaS providers. And the problem has always been that the UCaaS providers were entrepreneurs that wanted more money than the buyers thought they were worth. And they didn't have enough subscribers yet. So I think the market has finally hit a tipping point where some of these UCaaS providers actually have enough subscribers to make it meaningful. But also the early entrepreneurs are just tired, and they've been doing it long enough, some of them over a decade, that they want to get out. So I think based on that overlap, you'll start seeing a lot more acquisitions where 5-10 years ago, it was just too hard to do. The numbers could never line up between the expectations of the buyers and the sellers. And
Scott, do you think that those owners that are selling the companies are starting to see that the businesses may not be worth those values because of all the other ways now that people can communicate with WebRTC and Skype and Google Hangouts?
Finally got WebRTC finally emerges in this call. Great question.
I don't think it's that. I think it's a matter of there are certain comparables in the market where they had these visions of being valued as internet companies, and now they're being valued at 1x sales. Right. And they're going, geez, 1x sales. I guess it's not going to get any better than that. I might as well sell now because I think a lot of people see that it's only going down because if you were getting $30 a seat, now you're getting 28, 20. Like the prices are coming down, so the outlook is not getting better. So the timing is I think they see the handwriting on the wall. It just took a long time to reset the expectations.
Do you think
Well,
it's a race to a commodity, a true commodity, a race to zero? And how do these providers stop that? Especially when there's so many free methods out there. I mean, let me tell you, I have a 30-person cool little company. We don't have an IP phone. We use Google Hangouts in our cell phones. We don't feel like we need one. We might get one IP phone for the conference room, but how do these companies combat that?
I think the way they combat it is by providing a good enough quality of an offering as well as customer support. Because I think when you're in a small medium business, the difference between saving $5 or $10 a month and having your phone system not work, it's just not worth it. So I think there are going to be a handful of players that have a brand, that have nationwide exposure, that you can actually call them and they have a call center and they'll get increasing returns. And people who try to come in with, hey, I'll sell you it for $15 a month. Not only do I think that it won't work because you can't provide channels any money to sell your service, you're going to have to skimp on support, you're going to have to skimp on marketing. So I think the market is actually settling around this $30 range, plus or minus, because that's really the only range that allows you to do all those things, provide real support and service, and provide channels enough of an incentive to sell this. So
well, the market's also shifting, and so the requirements are always changing, and so we're seeing a lot more of an increase toward bundling, and the biggest bundle now is with Microsoft becoming a UCaaS provider, bundling it in with Microsoft Office and other services like that.
yeah.
We're seeing UCaaS for the first time getting some penetration into hospitality, which has never been doable before. But again, that's being bundled because the hotels need broadband internet, and companies like Verizon are bundling broadband internet with the hotel hospitality phone system, and so the bundles are always changing. And I want to get very specific to one new bundle here, referring to how the market is changing, and that's what I'm going to call this next generation hybrid. And what I mean by that is hybrid, for the most part, as we've talked about it for the past 5 years or so, has been some sort of transition step between premises and hosted. And it was generally two solutions that were competing against each other, possibly in a migration strategy, but either solution could replace the other. The next generation of hybrid seems to be more of a complementary solution, and we've seen Cisco making a lot of noise about this. They're calling it redefining hybrid. Interactive Intelligence is doing it with what they call pure cloud. ShoreTel is aligning around hybrid. So, and Microsoft, I just mentioned, they're doing what they call cloud PBX with the premises-based PSTN in that case. And so, more of a hybrid physical equipment that is being managed and controlled by the cloud. And if that is going to become a mainstream solution, that's going to really shake up a lot of these pure cloud providers that are on this report. Like 8x8 and Ring Central, et cetera. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think hybrid will take off or go away, or where's that going to go?
Right.
I think that those are solutions that work really well for these 1,000-person and up companies that the 8x8 has had a harder time getting into. I mean, the IT shops in these companies have a hard time getting, and for good reason, completely relying on the cloud for communications. So I think that this hybrid, these different types of hybrid solutions where you have fallback for certain capabilities, especially disaster control in a pure cloud, are very appealing to them because they kind of give them the best of both worlds. They give them on-premise near standard phone systems as close to as they can get, with all the advantages of the cloud, being able to manage it and fall back and the other things in the cloud. So I think it works better for a larger company. For a small company, I think it's more overhead than they need, and we don't have an IT person. And I think that under 100 people, you're going to see companies not having any IT, and you'd much rather have it all in the cloud.
Well, I'd like to come at it a couple of different ways, because on the high end, I think it's becoming much more accepted to be able to use the cloud, just like people use Salesforce.com. And I think they've really blazed a way to show that even your sensitive customer data can be used by the largest companies. So I think people are really going to say, well, if I can use Salesforce.com for CRM, my customer data, then maybe I should be able to use voice. I think the other thing is that I think the big vendors realize that in order to move people faster, it's just you can move faster by doing cloud. On the low end, I think what's happening is, it's not really stated in this report, but a lot of the reason why these companies are all talking about moving up market to mid and enterprise is that they're getting creamed slowly on the low end, and there's like 4 different things that are creaming on the bottom end. So the one thing is the Sherman's march of Comcast from going from low end and prosumer to SMEs. The fact that Comcast could come in at a very low price and bundle their voice service and do it with QoS over their own network,
Yep.
I think means that almost no one can compete with them on that level. Because a lot of these providers, we didn't really talk about it, are coming over the top. So if Comcast can come in at the same price or lower with QoS, then they're just going to slowly win all of these customers as they figure out how to go up market from 2 lines to 4 lines to 10 lines to 20 as they're doing.
But Comcast is generally only providing internet to SMB type businesses. I mean, once you get into larger businesses, they're usually dealing with other kinds of carriers than Comcast.
I think Comcast is going on market. I mean, they started out with prosumer and something that was similar, but now they have fiber and their prices. Instead of buying a T1, where I think the CLEX would traditionally, as we used to call them, CLEX, would win. A T1 is $500, and Comcast can come in with 100 megs for $99.
Yep.
And they keep going. And so a lot of the mid-sized companies are looking at that going, well, I would like Comcast to be my internet provider. Therefore, it's very easy to add voice over that. So I think they're actually crushing a lot of these sales that used to be for small and SME and now moving up market. So it's kind of forcing the 8x8s and RingCentrals to move up market. They don't really have a choice. The other thing, as you said, Brad, is I think it's increasing a lot of people just mobile only, especially for small businesses. Like, you have an iPhone. What do you need a phone for? The other thing that hasn't happened in North America, but I know BroadSoft's having a lot of success with this, is the reverse mobile bundling. So what they've done over there is they go to the mobile operators and they put together this package that goes something like this. Hey, SMB, you're using me for your mobile service and you love us, but that's mobile only. How about we give you a fixed line with a Polycom phone for $10 a month or €10 a month? And it's kind of the reverse of what we've always thought about of a mobile extension. It's actually fixed line extension. So your mobile operator essentially bundles in or throws in a business line with the same phone number and the same user experience and all the features in the web portal for $10. I think the players that are on this list are going to have a very hard time fighting that when that comes over to North America. And I think it's only a matter of when, because it's doing really well in Europe.
I see that coming sooner rather than later. It's inevitable.
All right. Well, I want to wrap up with this one last question then. Scott, you just touched on MPLS and over the top. And that triggered my thought around SDN WANs, which is the newer technology, which is quality of service over the top, effectively. And so I want to get your thoughts on emerging technologies that are going to shape the leaders in the next few years. Is it analytics? Is it SDN WAN? Is it the mobile type of story or bundling you're talking about? What do you think is as the industry is moving forward here the next few years? When we show you this report in let's say 2 years from now, and there's a new leader in the front, or it's 8x8 still. What are you going to say is that's why they're there? What changes are they making today that is going to be so important in a few years? Who wants to jump in on that one?
I think part of it is going to be how well these companies are able to transition from selling small companies over the internet, which are more mom and pop, to more mid-size companies that are established with more complex needs and requirements and the ability to service them. I think that's number one. I think, too, there's a sectoral shift going on, and it's a 10, 20-year shift from premises to cloud. And the number one area for these customers to grow in is going to be in this mid-market segment as people start replacing their PBXs, convincing them to not ever have a phone system again. So I think there's a lot of room for them to grow, but the growth has got to come all from up market. The down market is going to be scorched underneath them by cable companies and mobile and Skype. And that's what we're going to be talking about, is who was able to make the transition, and the people are going to be dead.
That's a good one. I have a feeling I know what Brad's going to say. Brad, what do you going to say?
I do think that everything that Scott said is right, but the real question to me is a bigger question. Will the UC market itself be a growing market? And my answer is no. I think that UC, in its way we define it today, as a bundling of what we would have seen as traditional voice line replacement into IP, is is a declining market and will be forever until it goes away. Because I do see communication changing, and it's changing not only just mobile, but contextual communication with Twilio and the things that Genband is doing with Candy and other companies. I mean, there's hundreds of companies doing similar things without platform technologies, but bundling the communication right in with the applications. And the fact that application and not the web or mobile is becoming the way that we deal with computers, and computers are becoming more invisible. I have an Amazon Echo right here beside me, which eventually I'll be able to say, call my wife if she's within 10 miles of here, and it'll be able to call her, and I'll talk right through it. So there's going to be this whole shift of how and where we communicate, because computers and communication devices, Apple Watches and everything else is getting more ubiquitous. And I see that fragmentation and movement away from a standard phone sitting on your desk, just eating this market away over time.
Well, I'm not sure if I forecasted my answer correctly. I was expecting you to talk about WebRTC, and maybe you did.
I did. It's all web. It's all weaved into there. You can do a lot of that stuff with WebRTC, but it's gotten a lot bigger. I think that my vision of where ubiquitous communications is going is a lot bigger, and I think that WebRTC is a part of that. Mobile is a part of that, and now what I'm calling invisible computing, invisible apps, is a part of that, where you're doing voice recognition, facial recognition, and the apps sort of acting more human and getting out of your way is definitely a part of that. So,
yeah, and I'm not. I used to, Dave, you know this. I used to be a lot more bullish on WebRTC, and I've kind of changed my mind a little bit. I'm a little less bullish. Not so much that I think WebRTC hasn't done what it said it was going to do. I look at the power of this thing, and I think about what it does now, and I think about 5 years from now. I mean, it's already awesome, and it's just mind-blowing how better it's going to be. I can't see the UCaaS market being able to do anything to keep up with it. So I think there's this great big sucking sound, as Ross Perot used to say, and that's Apple and Google sucking everything into their ecosystem. So I expect we'll see some pretty wild things in 5 years from now that will be very much more Apple and Google-centric than UCaaS. That's the biggest threat, because I think we're all so used to using these things. You have no idea how much more powerful they'll be, and it's going to start, if it's not already doing it, taking away a lot of the value that the UCaaS providers do today.
Yeah, I wouldn't throw out Amazon, because every one of these providers is running on Amazon. So those are the big three to me: Google, Apple, and Amazon.
Yeah, so you stretched it to 5 years there. I was asking you a couple of years, and I think even 5 years is probably too aggressive for what you're describing. And I don't believe that Apple or Google have any interest in this space. And maybe we're not saying anything differently there, but the I think things move a little slower than we like to admit, or than we like to admit, and it doesn't seem that Google or Apple has a whole lot of interest in enterprise communications, at least not the voice aspects of it. I think that we're seeing. I think that the UCaaS market has a pretty long future ahead of it still. This industry just moves it's amazing. We've still got a lot of TDM out there, a lot of old PBXs. People just want this stuff to work. There's so many things that the vendors are talking about today that are very, very different than what the customers are actually implementing. And then the next big disruptive leap, I think, is going to be more around LTE and what we call it voice over LTE. Genband's talking a lot about NPV, and really this next generation of networks, I think, is going to be probably more disruptive than anything else.
But let me clarify that, Dave. I think a lot of the services that we're already using are not. It's not because Apple and Google are doing anything. They're just making these devices that are awesome. And I think what's happening is that the enterprise and the UCaaS providers are still trying to provide their top-down planning, and I think it's the end users that are just changing their behavior. I think we know that all of us more and more are just shifting our communication away from traditional UCaaS toward these things. And I just think at some point there'll be a tipping point where the broadband networks will be so good and the phones will be so good and the applications will be so good that we won't even, it'll just be something we integrate into other things that we already do. And at some point people may say, just like a lot of people have done at home, they say, well, why do I need a phone line? I think that same thing is going to happen on the business side. We're not there yet because people are like, oh, I can spend $30 a month. But in 5 years from now, people may say, well, why am I doing that? I mean, I remember a few years back, I was at Twitter and they were at 1,000 people. And I said, what's your phone service? And they go, we use our phone. We use our mobiles.
Yeah.
That's a trend. That's what's going to happen more and more.
I think it's definitely going to happen more and more. And the other thing is, I think people are really good at predicting how fast change will be in a year, and they usually think that it will be faster than it will be in a year, and they're really bad at predicting how fast it will be in 10 years. They usually underestimate how much will change in 10 years. That's been proven. So I do think that you're right, Dave. You're probably right, and Scott's probably right.
Oh, I heard the first part loud and clear. Okay, well, then I'd like to thank both of you for joining me, and I look forward to ongoing conversations around this, and that'll wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Great.
guys.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks.